Get moving.
60 sheep came off that mountain the week the temperature dropped to 11 below, and by the time the trucks reached the stockyard, 4 of them were already dead in the trailer. The rest stood with their ears black at the tips and their legs stiff enough that 2 men had to carry them down the ramp instead of letting them walk. The auctioneer took one look and didn't even open the bidding at a real number. He just said take them for the price of the trailer fuel and let it go at that. Nobody moved. Not for a long moment. And then a man in the back of the yard raised his hand, a man nobody in that county had ever seen buy so much as a bag of feed, and he said he'd take all 60. Not the sound ones. All of them, the dying included. The man beside the rail, a big rancher named Dutch Yarnell, who ran 4,000 head across 3 counties, laughed loud enough that heads turned. He said the man had just bought himself 60 carcasses and a winter's worth of grief, and that half of them would be dead by Friday and the other half by New Year's. He meant it as a joke at another man's expense. It would turn out to be the last joke he ever made about him. If you've ever watched someone everyone else had already written off, turn out to be the only one who understood exactly what he was looking at. Stay with me. This one earns the whole hour. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I like knowing how far these stories travel. The man's name was Everett Kade, and 11 weeks before that auction, he had been living alone in a rented room above a hardware store 200 miles south, sleeping 4 hours a night if he slept at all, 3 tours behind him, and nothing in front of him he could name. He'd left the army the year before at 41, and the discharge papers had used words like honorable and commendable, and none of those words had told him what to do with a Tuesday afternoon that had nothing in it. He'd tried the things people suggested, a counselor twice a month, a part-time job at a warehouse he'd quit after 6 weeks because the fluorescent lights felt like an ambush. What he had instead of a plan was an uncle's will, read 3 months late because nobody had known where to find him, leaving him 1,100 acres of high country his uncle had run sheep on for 40 years before arthritis took his hands, and the operation had quietly bled out to nothing. Everett drove up to see the place expecting to sell it inside a week. What he found was a house standing square against wind that never fully stopped, a barn with good bones and a bad roof, and a single filing cabinet in the back room that turned out to be the only thing on the property his uncle had actually kept in order. Inside it, in green canvas-bound notebooks going back 3 decades, was a record of every animal his uncle had ever run, written in a hand so small and exact, it looked more like a supply manifest than a diary. Weather, losses, weight gains, and one phrase, underlined so many times across so many years that the pencil had worn a groove into the paper. Cold doesn't lie. Everett read 4 years of those notebooks in a single week, sitting on the floor of that cold back room the way a man reads something he suspects is the only conversation he's going to get with a person he never properly met. He didn't understand most of it at first, but near the end of the last full notebook, dated the autumn before his uncle's hands finally quit him for good, there was a line set apart from everything around it, boxed in pencil. The ones that make it through a bad storm on their own legs are the only stock worth building on. Everything else is just weight you're feeding. There was one person left who could tell him what that meant. A woman named Ida Marsh, 78, who had run the county's only remaining commercial flock on the ridge above town, and who had, according to 2 separate people at the feed store, forgotten more about cold weather sheep than the rest of the county combined. She was also, it turned out, a widow of a man who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, and she looked at Everett for a long moment the first time he came to her door. The particular look of someone recognizing a specific kind of tired. She didn't waste time on comfort. She told him that any fool could keep sheep alive with enough grain and enough heat lamps and enough money, and that none of that taught you a single true thing about the animal underneath it. What his uncle had understood, she said, was that a sheep that came through real cold on nothing but its own body was telling you something a warm one never could. That the weak ones showed themselves early, before you'd spent a season's feed on them, and the ones that stayed standing were the foundation you built everything else on. Buy the survivors, she told him. Not the pretty ones. The ones still on their feet after the worst night. That was the whole of her advice, delivered over 1 cup of coffee that had gone cold before either of them touched it. It was enough to send Everett to that stockyard 3 weeks later. He'd stood at the rail of that trailer a long time before he raised his hand, watching not which sheep looked strongest, but which ones still tracked him with their eyes, instead of standing glassy and still, which ones pushed toward the front of the pack, instead of collapsing into the corners. There had been 11 he marked that way in his head before the bidding even opened. He bought all 60 anyway, because his uncle's notebooks had also taught him something about what you owed an animal that had already survived the worst part. He hauled them home over 2 trips in a borrowed trailer that groaned the whole way. And he turned them loose into a barn he'd spent 3 sleepless nights bedding deep with straw. And he did not sleep at all that first week, walking the barn every 2 hours through the night with a headlamp and a thermometer. The same rhythm he'd once kept on watch a world away, except this time the thing he was guarding had a pulse he could actually save. He lost 9 the first 10 days, burying each one at the tree line, and wrote every loss in a fresh green notebook of his own, the way his uncle had without deciding to. The feed store had already turned it into a joke that kept retelling itself. Dutch Yarnell called them Everett's popsicles within earshot of people who'd repeat it. Everett answered plainly and did not rise to it. The same flat non-reaction he'd learned in places where reacting got people killed. Winter that year came down the way it did every few seasons in that country, with a stretch of nights in January that never rose above single digits and a wind that came off the peaks like it had somewhere specific to be. This was the season everyone expected to finish what the mountain had started. Dutch told anyone who'd listen that the popsicle experiment would be over by the thaw, and there'd be 51 carcasses to prove it. But Everett had the notebooks, and the notebooks were full of winters like this one. He fed the flock the old careful way, hay he'd put up himself in the fall from ground. Ida had walked with him and told him not to overgraze, feeding it in the sheltered draw where the worst of the wind couldn't reach. Walking out every single morning before light to break ice and count heads, the same discipline that had once kept men alive, on watch now keeping animals alive in a barn. Every one of his 51 survivors came through that January standing. By March, 5 of them were visibly bred, on the strength of a single line in his uncle's notebook about not waiting for proof before you trusted an animal that had already earned it. And by May there were lambs on the ground, born easy in new spring grass, straight-legged and clear-eyed, and none of them lost. He didn't tell anyone. He wasn't built for announcing things, not anymore. He let the lambs speak for themselves, the way true things moved through that county, through the feed store and the gas station, until by June it was generally known that the veterans' popsicles had thrown a full crop of lambs and lost none of them doing it. It was received at the feed store with the kind of silence that, for men like that, was the loudest thing they knew how to say. That summer Everett began in a small way to sell. Not the ewes and not yet the lambs, but the idea that had been forming since he'd first understood what his uncle had actually spent 40 years building. Not a commodity flock competing on weight against outfits 10 times the size, but a small hardened line of sheep so suited to that particular mountain that the wool and the meat off them were different from anything else in the county. He had the first lambs processed at a small locker plant 2 towns over, and he cooked a chop for his own supper on a stove that still ran too hot from his uncle's day, and understood, chewing, exactly what 40 years of quiet stubbornness had actually been for. The first person he sold to was the man at the feed store counter, who drove out to the ranch himself the following week, something no one in that county had bothered to do before. He walked the pasture with Everett in low September light, knelt down, pushed his fingers into sod that hadn't been overgrazed in a generation, and said that in 30 years of watching this county farm itself into dust, he hadn't felt ground like that outside the river bottoms. Everett said it was mostly his uncle's doing. Word moved the way it always moved there, until by autumn Everett had a waiting list he couldn't fill, and had raised his prices without anyone balking once. The second winter was easier, not because it was milder, but because the flock had grown to over 100, and Everett wintered them the same patient way, and lost almost none. It was that winter Dutch Yarnell finally drove up the ranch road, not to apologize, because men like Dutch don't come to apologize, but to see for himself what had begun nagging at him from a distance. He sat in his truck a long while looking at a flock standing sleek and unbothered in a sheltered draw, working through hay Everett had grown himself. Then he rolled his window down and said, flatly, that they looked good. From Dutch, that was as close to surrender as the man had in him. He got out, walked the frozen field, ran a hand along the back of a ewe that had been one of the 4 dying animals 2 winters before, and said he'd been running stock in that county 30 years, feeding more every season just to keep his ground where it was. And he'd driven up expecting to find failure, and instead was standing on grass in February better than his own managed in June. He asked to see the notebooks. Everett showed him. Dutch never told the men at the feed store he'd been wrong, not directly. But he came back that spring with his worst 40 acres fenced off and rested the way Ida had taught Everett, and 4 ewes bought at full price to start it. Word of Dutch's conversion did what Everett's success alone never could. Other ranchers started showing up at the gate, men who'd worked their ground to dust their whole lives, and had a bad feeling in their bones about where it was headed. Everett walked them through the pasture, and never once charged a man for the walking. The blizzard came in the 4th winter, the worst the county had seen in living memory. A 2-day system that dropped 4 feet of snow and buried the county road under drifts taller than the trucks that couldn't move through them. It knocked out power across 3 counties. It stranded cars on the highway and trapped families in homes with no heat and dwindling wood. And it caught most of the county's herds exactly where 4 decades of hard grazing had left them, thin, unsheltered, with nothing in reserve. Everett didn't wait to be asked. He'd spent a career reading exactly this kind of chaos, and by the 2nd morning he had his old truck chained and running, hauling hay and water not just to his own flock but to Dutch's rested 40. And then, when the county's volunteer response stalled, trying to reach isolated homes on unplowed roads, Everett organized what was left of it. He knew how to move people and supplies through terrain that had already beaten everyone else, because it was, in its own way, the only kind of operation he'd ever fully understood. He and Caleb, the feed store owner's grandson who'd started helping out on weekends, spent 18 hours over 2 days reaching 4 households that hadn't been reached, hauling propane and hay, and in one case, carrying an elderly man with a broken hip out through drifts on an improvised sled built from a stock gate. When the snow finally stopped and the county began digging out, Everett's flock stood in the draw exactly as they'd stood through every winter before, thin margins intact, nothing lost. Dutch's rested 40 had held too. The men who still ran their ground the old hard way lost animals by the dozens, and lost more than that in what it cost them to admit why. Dutch stood at Everett's fence one gray morning after, and he didn't say much, because he never had. He said only that Everett's uncle had been right 30 years before any of them were ready to hear it, and that the whole county had spent 3 decades laughing at the 2 men who'd actually understood the one thing that mattered. Everett didn't answer that directly. He only said that his uncle had written that cold doesn't lie, and that he guessed the cold had been telling the truth to anyone patient enough to listen a long time before any of them started paying attention. He still keeps the notebook. Ida Marsh, well into her 80s now, still comes up the ranch road most Tuesdays, and still says perhaps 1/10 of what she's thinking, which is exactly as much as it's ever needed to be. Caleb has his own notebook now, copied out in his own hand from Everett's, the same way Everett's come from his uncle's. The same quiet inheritance passed hand to hand down a mountain that had once been ready to write all of it off as nothing. The sheep nobody wanted are the reason 4 households made it through a blizzard that took down half the county's power grid. Nobody in that valley calls them popsicles anymore. They just watch the ridge now, the same way they always did, except now they're waiting to see what he'll build next. If you've ever been counted out and proven the ones counting wrong, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about people the world gave up on too soon.